This podcast is a part of the More Podcast Network.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily Leader Podcast by Pattern Talent, where we interview great leaders and we seek to understand leadership. I'm Brad McDonald.
And I'm Taylor Jessup, and we really hope that you enjoy this episode.
We are back, another episode of the Daily Leader here. Brad McDonald is my co-host, and we've got Bill High on today, which is going to be a fantastic podcast. Super excited about it. Brad, do you want to take a minute and just introduce our guest there?
I do. But before I do that, I'm noticing something in your background there, Taylor, a certain cylinder that looks like it's been recently fired back up. What do we have back there? What's going on back there?
Well, that is old Bessie or Bertha, depending on who you ask, and that would be our sponsor Ellery May, her candle company that just opened back up since the twins came out. So first time. So I think she had a launch a couple weeks ago. I think there's a little bit left, but not much if you're interested. And there will be another launch coming up pretty soon. Her most popular launch, the Harry Potter candles, for those who are Harry Potter fanatics like my wife is. So that's coming up soon. So yeah, it's all fired back up. She's been trying to get back at it. And I think she put up a video of her wrapping up all of her candles to get ready to ship out at the same time she was trying to take care of two twins. So she's pretty fantastic.
I love it. So Ellery May Candle Co. We'll have links in the show notes. You guys can go get the latest and the greatest, right? The post twins.
Post twins candles. Yeah. Lighting tiny fires in your house that smell like heaven, so.
Her unwanted, unsolicited.
Advertisement for me. Yeah. From me, I guess I should say.
Well, I'm really excited this afternoon because we get to interview someone who has become increasingly significant to me, and that's Bill High, who is the founder of 7th Gen Consulting, as well as Legacy Stone, where he is helping families develop their values, their vision, and their mission, whether those are high net worth families who maybe have multi-generational family businesses, or those are even newlyweds who are looking to really just establish themselves as a family unit, to be interdependent by choice, and to raise children with a strong sense of values, vision, and mission. And so Bill started his career in big law on the heels of his JD, and from there transitioned into the charitable giving, particularly faith-based charitable giving space, where he helped to really give high net worth families an opportunity to designate their funds to basically just organizations and institutions that they're passionate about, they're interested in giving to. So he did counsel and guidance for that. Went from there outside of the charitable giving world into really family legacy and family business consulting, where he's helped some really high profile families all across the world to develop vision, mission, and values for their family, as well as written some books. One that I think we could highlight, which we'll get into a little bit today on the periphery, which is Leadership Not by the Book, which he wrote in collaboration with David Green, the CEO of Hobby Lobby, about some of the unique leadership tactics that the Green family used to lead Hobby Lobby, and continues to do that to this day. And so, Bill, welcome to the Daily Leader. We're really grateful for your time and eager to learn more about you.
Yeah, glad to be with you.
I'm excited. I know you two have a relationship going back, and I don't. So I'm going to ask you to fill in the gaps in your story in just a second. But before I do that, Bill, one of the things that I like to ask people that come on the show is kind of give us any kind of fun facts or something that we should know about you. I think one of the things that sometimes happens with leaders and successful leaders like yourself is we forget that leaders are people too. And so what give me like there fun facts about you that our listeners should know of.
Well, I grew up playing baseball, so I always had that great passion to play baseball. Thought I'd be a major league baseball pitcher. Played through high school, and I was actually throwing pretty good heat in high school, about 85 miles an hour, which is pretty good for a high school player. But a couple guys on our team were throwing in the 90s. So they got drafted and I didn't go on and play. But anyway, there's a fun fact. I still follow baseball today, even though my boys played soccer. So there you go.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. You got an MLB team there?
Well, I'm in Kansas City, so Kansas City Royals, and that was my first team, and still follow the game, still follow the Royals. Don't go out to the games quite as much, but I do remember my very first game where I got to watch George Brett as a rookie who became ultimately a Hall of Fame baseball player. So one of those memories that really sticks with you.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. Yeah, baseball is so nostalgic. It's just got a lot of tradition and history. How do you feel? We'll jump in just a sec, but how do you feel about the new pitch clock? Have you enjoyed that? I know it's changed the game a little bit.
Baseball needed to speed up if they were going to attract a next generation of fans. So it's definitely sped up the game. And there were a lot of games. I mean, I played that game when I was a player, stepping out of the box, trying to disrupt rhythm, but it sure took the game a long time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's something we get to talk about today is, the next generation and connecting with them. So there's an interesting take that, hey, to keep that next generation in line, the game was going to have to change a little bit, right? To make that connection. So that's awesome. I think it's been really good for the game too. So, all right. Well, give us kind of your quick story. If you were to give us kind of the 3-minute version of Bill, who you are and how you got to where you are and the things that made you who you are and what you've done. What is that? Who is Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. So Brad started with the law career, but ultimately, I grew up in a family of six. My dad came from a family of eight, lived in a 3-room log cabin in the hills of the Missouri Ozarks. A very backwards kind of background. He joined the service, was in the army, went overseas, stationed in Japan, where he met my mom, brought her back, had 6 kids. I was number 5 out of 6, and we were dirt poor. We were just as poor as church mouse. Salvation Army brought us Christmas gifts. I mean, it was a tough life, very dysfunctional family background. But we did we had a house fire that caused us to move, which ultimately led us to a small town near the Missouri River. And somebody planted a church in that small town. And that was a big turning point for me because I came to faith, understood the larger narrative that I was not God and that there really was one. So that was a turning point because a couple years later, my dad passed away. I was just 12, left my mom with 6 kids to raise. But I was fortunate because I had an older brother who at the time went away to college. And ultimately, he was kind of paved the way to set the example for us to go to college. So I went to college, ended up getting out of there, thought I was going to teach and coach, and got an offer to go to law school. Full ride, went to law school, practiced law, big law firm, 12 years. It was a great ride, learned a lot. I was a trial lawyer, but that ultimately had always felt like I would end up in the nonprofit space. So I started volunteering in the inner city, but that led to the need to find some way to create fundraising. So that's what led me into the charitable foundation space. Did that for more than 20 years, saw $6 billion come into that foundation, about 4 billion get distributed back out. But in the course of that, that's where I ultimately began consulting with families. So that's a little bit about the business background. Married, 4 kids, been married almost 37 years, 4 grandkids, 2 dogs. So
Yeah,
no cats. I'm not a cat fan. So
not a yeah.
I apologize
Neither am
in
I.
advance to anybody listening to this who likes cats, but tough luck.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you think we have cat followers out there? I feel like most of our people are going to be dogs. I feel like you're in good company here on the podcast,
Okay,
Bill.
that's good. Well, there may be some cat fans, but anyway.
Well, maybe we'll have to take a poll after this. That's awesome. Thank you for that. That's such an incredible snapshot of where you've come from and all the way, and all the successes and the trials and everything along the way that you've had. So, and tell me a little bit more about the heart. I'd love to know kind of the why it's so important to you to be serving families and like multi-generational family businesses.
Well, I mean, if you start from my own background, I've got a friend who says that wherever your deepest wound is where the flower grows.
Mm,
My deepest wound comes from family, the family that I didn't have. So, personally, I always wanted to have a great family. And so I did. I got married, had kids, and worked really hard at it. But when I was in the charitable foundation space, I'd come from this legal background. I got to work with a lot of financial advisors, estate planners, the whole bit. But one of the big things that happened is I realized is that that space didn't have all the answers. And because I had a family that approached me that said, "Hey, we need help with our family. Not a lawyer, not an accountant. We don't need anybody to sell us life insurance. We just need help with our family." I didn't know anybody who did that. So ultimately, that led me to work with them and actually help them begin to craft a plan where they could actually bring in kids and in laws into the business, but to succeed on a long term basis. So my eyes were really open to this idea of multi generational family. Here in the US, we just don't appreciate that. If you have a business, the typical mindset is you build a business so you can sell it, build to exit. And lots of times by default, the second approach is that we build to split it. So we grow it and we reach a place where, like, gosh, I got to do something with this. So we hand off shares to our kids. And oftentimes that approach really does lead to a split because you've got four kids. It's not likely that all four of them are going to work in the business and that they're going to get along. So usually there's some kind of division. And then the approach that I think is much more common in the Asian world, the European world, is you build to sustain or build for purpose. And that's really, I think, the big eye opening idea for me is that we want to help families build for purpose, to build to sustain enterprises, because that's the easiest way that you can sustain culture inside of a family, but sustain culture in communities. So that's a whole mouthful, but that's a little bit quick aside.
that's great. That's great. I love that. I love that. Takes me back a little bit to the, Simon Sinek and trying to play the infinite game. If you've read that book, rather than playing the short term, that we do a lot where, hey, we're going to split up the company, sell it, like you said, going, no, hey, let's think bigger and broader about this. And I agreed. I think that's a huge challenge is that we often, I will say, for myself, I don't know that I do a good enough job of thinking about the next generation after me of my family, of my two girls, and what business could I potentially leave them, and then their children's children, and how does that work? So I I think that that's great. I love that you can so clearly articulate kind of your why behind what you're doing. I think that's super powerful. So, in kind of in line with that a little bit, tell me if we stick on family business for a little bit. So, what unique problems do you see family businesses facing?
Well, I don't know that they're unique. I think the key is to identify what they are. But I do think, by the way, you got to step back and say, where are we at in the history of the world? And so I think you got to put it in a framework. So we are at a place in the history of the world where we're the greatest wealth transfer ever. This is like anywhere from $60 trillion to some people have said it's now $120 trillion. So there's more wealth accumulated in this generation that's going to change hands. And as a result, the $60 trillion, just take that as a for instance, people don't know what that means. If 1% of that wealth were transferred, that'd be $600 billion. So now you go 60 times that. The amount of money is so profound that
Mhm.
families are being forced, probably for the first time in the history of the world, to say, what are we going to do with that? And maybe not all of it should go to the kids. The great opportunity in the nonprofit space is to be able to say, well, what would happen if we would utilize those dollars to solve some of the greatest problems in the world? So that's the framework for the discussion. Within that, at the heart of that wealth transfer are all these family owned businesses. And the key to successful family owned business, successful generational legacy, we say there's three big buckets. You got to have relational health. That's not a new issue. We just call it by its name. So, relational health, how does the family thrive relationally? One of the key things in the relational health area is you've got to be able to successfully navigate conflict. Most families avoid it, they don't know how to do it. But in addition to navigating conflict, you've got to have an understanding of the people at the table. So we use a lot of assessments just to work to help people understand one another. So that's first big bucket. Second big bucket is you've got to have structure and governance. And this is unique to what we do because, again, most people think about structure and governance as a financial planning tool, maybe estate planning. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how do you actually govern the family, whether it's a family council, it's the question about who votes, what do successors look like, what do in laws, what are the roles that they play. There's a myriad of issues that you have to get into when you talk about governance. So think about it like the family constitution. And then the third big bucket that we address is next generation training. Uh, both the governance and next generation training are the two big missed issues. Most people, when they get to this issue around family owned business, they think about, I'm going to go get an estate plan drafted by a lawyer, and it doesn't have any of these kind of issues related to it. Next gen training, it's a 70% failure rate from generation 1 to 2, 85% failure rate from generation 2 to 3, 97% failure rate to generation 4. So that tells you we don't do a very good job preparing the next generation.
That is really well said. There's definitely a gap there in in so many of those buckets. So, man, that's really good.
Bill, the numbers that you just shared are kind of both on the wealth transition side and on the failure rate of multi-generational family business side. Like those are daunting. Those are hard to wrap your mind around. And to me, it leads back to the bigger question, which I know you're passionate about, and I can't wait for our audience to hear the way that you answer this question. But tell us, what is legacy? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think that's obviously one of the things, Brad, that people have gotten confused when we talk about legacy. Most people want to put it in the bucket of that's plan giving or estate planning. And of course, the adage is legacy is what you leave behind. So as a result of that kind of mindset, well, I'm going to leave it behind. I've definitely had people come and say, well, if I'm going to leave it behind, I'll just let the kids figure it out. If there's problems, they'll figure it out. But that's not the idea of legacy. The bigger idea of legacy is what you put in motion. That's how we describe it. It is that you are setting in motion a greater set of relationships, a greater set of values. And that's why, again, if you go to different parts of the world, you'll see families that succeed for 200, 300 years, 400 years, because what they are putting in place is a system and a set of beliefs that can carry on from one generation to the next. So that's why we define it that way. Legacy is what you put in motion. And when you do that, that's your greatest chance to impact the world on an ongoing basis, but also your family.
We talked about this a little bit. We kind of hinted at some of these key areas, but why primarily do families fail to build a lasting legacy? Why do they fail to actually set something into motion, something of meaning and substance into motion?
At one level, Brad, I think you could deal with that from a symptom perspective. Again, I think you got to step back and you got to ask yourself, where are we at in the history of the world? And there's a whole group of authors and historians, sociologists who've written about the rise and fall of nations. You could retitle that The Rise and Fall of Family, but the short of it is that virtually every family starts out the same way. You understand this. You got a little kid, and who gets to sleep, who gets to get up, all that kind of stuff. But we start out very interdependent by necessity. We're forced to come together. But as a family grows, as a nation goes, ultimately you reach a place where you have the ability to choose independence. In the history of the United States, if we put it in that context, After World War II, the United States became the dominant superpower in the world because they controlled the seas. It also led to the greatest prosperity ever for the nation. Well, that prosperity leads to that question about what do I do with all this stuff that I have? You can either satisfy yourself or you can seek to invest in future generations. It is who owns that asset? Is it mine or do I steward those assets for future generations? But all that's some of the bigger context of what's at play.
What role do you feel communication, intergenerational communication, plays in this transfer of legacy?
So, family communication is clearly the first breakup that occurs. Usually, what we say is the very first one is a misunderstanding of personality differences. So, you've got a dad or a mom, as the case may be, that's trying to force their kid who's an artist to become an entrepreneur, or the kid that's an introvert to be an extrovert, all those kind of things. You got to let people figure out their calling and figure out the right place and provide a pathway for them to come join. But additionally, just related to communication, it's also a communication of the family values. So, the people that have studied this and what we've seen is that it's the families who clearly articulate their values and their kids and grandkids reaffirm and adopt those values from one generation to the next are the ones who are successful. Those are a couple big points. One of the other key points around communication is you've got to be able to communicate the stories that make up your family. We just did a workshop around this whole idea. We had a guy that said, man, once I did that exercise built around story, it forced me to go back and look at my grandparents and their story of how they came here and how when they decided to change things, it changed the trajectory of family. You got to know the stories that you came from because it's those stories that help provide information and some definition about who you are and who you'll become. So those are a few key points as I see what we see inside of families related to communication.
That's so good. I love that idea that, hey, when they decided to change, then everything could change. That I am I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier and talk about conflict for a little bit because I think you mentioned it's one of those things that most families, and mine included, a lot of times we just like to things get too tough, we're just going to bury it, apologize, move on. But, whatever we're going to do to avoid conflict. And I feel culturally, at least in America, this seems like a huge issue. Like we just are not good at solving conflicts. So, why is like intergenerational conflict so difficult? And like, how can we equip the generations to communicate more effectively so that they can have healthy conflict?
Yeah, there's lots of issues around this. Number one, is just identifying what conflict styles there are. So you've maybe heard or read studies around this, but generally people default to one of a handful of different conflict styles. Some people are very conflict avoidant, and that's a style. It's not a winning style. It can be a short term style because sometimes it's helpful to say, hey, we're not going to deal with that right now. You just can't let that be forever. So, one, conflict style is important to understand. But the second big thing as it relates to conflict is also understanding the lens that you bring to conflict. So, we're in a unique time in history where, for instance, there's a generational lens that we've never really experienced before, meaning that you've got the war generations who had a set of values, faith, freedom, family, duty duty and honor. My wife's grandparents, my parents grew up during the Great Depression. Well, when they went out and worked in the garden or worked in the field, they didn't say, I don't really feel like that. I don't feel called to that work. It was a function of duty and honor. So that generation looks at the world much differently. And then you follow those war generations by the boomer generation who began, frankly, they worked really hard and they worked to a place where they had options. It's the boomer generation in many respects, the first generation that ever retired with options. I can go play golf, or I don't have to work the rest of my life. So they have a very different lens than the war generations. But then you got the next couple generations, Gen X and the millennials, who frankly they face high rates of divorce. And so the pendulum swings. We're like, I'm not going to work that hard. I'm going to I want to be able to not work to live. I want to be able to do enough work so that I can experience my lifestyle that I want. So, generational lens is one aspect of this discussion. But then, frankly, most families just don't have any process around how they have conflict. It is what I call spontaneous conflict. I call Brad a name. Brad, you're a dummy. And he says, well, you're a bigger dummy. And it just goes back and forth, as opposed to when that conflict starts to happen, I can actually identify what's occurring and say, hey, Brad, can we slow down here a little bit and actually work through a process to create clarity, which brings understanding.
Yeah.
We do a whole workshop just on conflict. I don't know why that's such a big deal.
No, that's you articulated that very well. I think those three things are great for our practicality corner of one, identifying the conflict style of each person, which I think is super important, right? Two is the lens that that person views the world through and that they bring into conflict. And then three, and this may be one of the biggest ones, even if you do those two, I'm not sure a lot of people come up with a process for how we deal with that. And I think that whole train of thought right there is so important because I think we so often we don't even start at the beginning where we go, hey, this person is coming at whatever conflict or issue we're having from a completely different like context in terms of the way that they handle the conflict and view on the world. I think actually if we were to do those two things, then you could actually start to build that process. I think that would radically transform most people for their conflict.
Yeah, a lot of your listeners, I suspect, would be people who believe in system and process. Maybe some of them are EOS guys, the entrepreneurial operating system. Maybe they're StratOp, and they have processes about how they run their organizations. What we lack is the FOS, the family operating system. Within that family operating system, you've got to not only know your vision, mission, values, but you've got to have that process by which you manage conflict. If you follow Lencioni, what's he talk about? What is the first thing that you got to have? You got to have trust. And then the next thing that you got to have is you got to have meaningful conflict.
That's so good. And both of those, I know in my own personal experience, if I don't take the time to understand somebody's lens, then I just feel like they probably don't trust me because I have judgments about them before we even get started.
Yeah, and that whole thing, I mean, one of the things that we do in the process of getting to communication is we also do personality profiles. And that's super helpful because my wife and I were married, I don't know how long we'd been married, 10 plus years. But until we did a personality profile, really took the time to understand it, and we just had some basic misunderstandings that I'm very much a visionary. I live in the future. She is very much a present-minded, task-focused person. So she likes getting instructions and a list of what to do. And I'm a visionary with lots of big ideas. And so just a simple thing is I would say, hey, honey, I got this idea. What do you think about this? Here's the idea. Well, that's not how she thinks. She is a process person. So she just get caught and trapped. And I'd say, like, no, just give me your idea. And she's like, can I think about it? And she'd say something that I thought was stupid, like, I'd give her this big vision, and then she'd come up with something like, well, how's that going to work? Or point out something very concrete. And, sometimes I call those people the dream killers. But the reality is she just needed time to process and think about it, very present focus, very pragmatic.
No, that's so good. I think we will constantly clash unless we understand the context that somebody else is coming from and the lens that they see the world through. But here's the catch. The really cool part is if we actually do understand their context and their lens, then we can actually have an incredibly healthy relationship where, hey, if you're a dreamer, that's great. But dreamers often need people to let them have times to dream, but also go, okay, but now practically let's break this down and how we can actually be better for it. That conflict allows us to grow if we can understand, where somebody else is coming from. Otherwise, I think we'll butt heads all the time.
Well, there's a proverb that says, by wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it's established.
Mm.
And that understanding, in the metaphor of that proverb, that's the idea of you got great footings, a foundation. If you have understanding, you have a foundation of understanding that helps you build the relationship. And the proverb goes on and says, by knowledge, the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So that's your idea.
Powerful. I appreciate that reference to the Proverbs. In this, so I love how if you guys are familiar with the Arbinger Institute, Taylor, I know you are because you and I are talking a lot about leadership and self-deception and the work that they did there lately. But they have this great tool that they use where they talk about, devoting all of our time to fixing things that's not working versus, helping things go right. And one of the things I've loved about my increasing exposure to your process, Bill, is that you devote a judicious amount of time in training and developing people through consulting and workshops on helping things go right, creating the systems and process within the family, and even the rhythms and routines on a calendar to help things go right. And I can't think of a better place for us to start that conversation than values. So, I have the opportunity to understand, through our training, three different types of values and, values as a core values as a metaphor. But explain to our listeners some of how you help families develop a set of core values and why that's so critical for their success in helping things go right.
Yeah, I mean, the first you deal with the problem. What's the problem is that most people adopt that adage that values are caught, not taught. And that proverb or adage is only partially true. If you never articulate what your values are, they're pretty hard to catch. We also know, again, back to that whole idea of family failure, most of the failure comes around communication and trust issues, but specifically with reference to values. So you've got to articulate them in order to be able to pass them on. There's not a lot of magic about how you do all that process, but we say that one of your first keys is to come up with a values metaphor, because the metaphor is an easy way to teach values. So if you got young kids, if you say, hey, values are the moral and ethical principles of behavior, a 5-year-old's not going to be able to grasp that. But if you say, hey, on the other hand, values are like a compass, or values are like the rock, that is something visual, then they can grab a hold of, then that means something. So you start with the idea of metaphor, and then from there you go to identifying, say, 3 to 5 family values. We say that the values need to be first upward. They got to look outside of yourself. That's the idea of faith as a first idea. God's a value. Second is the idea that you're looking for relational or horizontal values. Oftentimes we see families that their first two values are faith and family. Sometimes it's faith and relationship, faith and community. But this idea that we need one another is the second big part. And then usually you go to aspirational values: integrity, generosity, gratitude, the things that we want our behaviors to look like. So if you come up with those kind of guardrails, then part of the key in building culture successfully, whether it's a company or a family, is that those values become protective, because they help us define what we will not do. At the same time, they will define what we will do, so they become attractive. The successful family cultures around the world define those values clearly, which cause their children to want to become part of that.
There's something on your wall over your left shoulder there, hanging on your wall. Would you be willing to share that with our listeners? I know what that is, but
Yeah, this is our family vision, mission, and values. And so, one of the keys, again, if you appreciate that inside of companies, companies go to great lengths. They hire consultants who, spend days, and it's usually an arduous process. But you don't see that on the family side. People are far more
Mhm.
intentional about their businesses than they are about family. Why is that? It's because we derive identity from our work. It used to be historically that we drove our identity from the family. That's how we came up with surnames. Smith, I don't know what McDonald was. McDonald had a farm? No. But anyhow, you get the idea is that last name meant something. It's who we are. But anyway, what we did is we came up that went through that same process. Our values, we came up with an acronym. So the acronym is GASSER. How about that? God's Word, Generosity, Adventure, Story, and Restoration. So those are the values that guide us as a family. As a mission statement, we want to be rooted in Christ so that we can abound in gratitude. So, again, you hear some of those values ideas come out. And then ultimately, we view ourselves as being mentors. So, we talk about the idea of disciples everywhere for generations.
oh, powerful.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know. Do you know, Bill? Like when in history did that change from our identity being derived from our family to our identity more so being derived from our business? Do you have an idea on when that happened?
It's been an ongoing thing for sure, Taylor. But we do know that, again, if you kind of take a look at the historical arc, certainly in the United States, family started as what we call commonwealth, where the economic, religious, social life of the family was combined. So we were an agrarian country by nature. And so we needed the family to farm the land. So we drove identity as a family
Mm,
to work and live the land. We passed on the land because that land was passed on as a way to preserve the family. We wouldn't just sell the land because then what would the next coming generation do? But as the family started to turn to an industrialized society, so the Industrial Revolution sure was part of the breaking point where what happened is that kids became less valuable. They were viewed as expensive, so we didn't want to have too many. The family became nuclear versus multi generational, intergenerational, the whole bit. There's a great movie out there called Avalon. Uh, so it can be a little slow, but it certainly illustrates this point about the progression of family because you'll see families that came here as immigrants and there were big huge family gatherings, and then by the time certainly of the industrial revolution, now those gatherings are much smaller. It's just mom and dad and kids at the dinner table. 1960, it was still 72% of the families were mom and dad and kids gathered at the dinner table. Not ideal, but at least we had the unit. Today it's like 45%. We've way declined. If you go into the inner city, you go into certain parts of the country, you'll see that percentage drop to 1%, 2%. It's just a mess. And so, if you can retain the unit and that identity, you got a better chance of success.
yeah, no, I love that. I like trying to understand the history behind it. I think that gives us good context from where we have been to where we're going and where we're headed. And I think most of us on this call would say, hey, like, okay, we understand we are becoming more and more fragmented and less family oriented, right? That's unfortunately maybe the most connected part of any time in history via the internet and quick access and FaceTime and all the things you could think of is simultaneously probably the most fragmented.
Well, the rise and fall of nations is all about that. When you reach that state where the emphasis is on the individual as opposed to the family and the community, that's when you're about ready to crack up. So it's a big, big problem here where we're at in the history of the world. Not a great great thing to be saying.
So yeah, that's tough. That's tough. And that's true, to practically break it down, if you think about a basketball team or a baseball team, it's not about a certain individual, it's about the team. The team does better when the team has clear vision, values, mission, and is playing for each other and not for themselves. So core values are so important. So I love, like core values, vision, and mission. So can you talk just for a little bit about like, hey, if you have core values, it's that's great work, but it's not enough, right? You still need a clear vision and mission. So can you talk a little bit about the importance behind why do families need a clear vision, and then how does that distinguish itself even from the mission?
So, vision is what we describe as the ideal state. It's the painting the picture of what you want your family to be like in the next 100 years or 200 years. And, there's the Bible verse that talks about where there is no vision, the people perish. But we've seen that repeatedly. So, vision is typically, we say it's 5 to 7 words that cast the picture for that ideal future state. It's the picture of what you want to be. So, again, even if you look into the Bible and you say, hey, how's that play itself out? Father Abraham, who, the whole song is about, God took him outside and said, hey, Abraham, look up at the stars, so shall your descendants be. He gave him a vision. And so you don't think that impacts a guy like Abraham every night, clear night. He walks outside and says, wow, that's what my family is going to be like. So you got to paint the picture in some kind of visual form, written form, that so that family can say, okay, this is what we're supposed to be. Again, historically, if you take a look at where we were an agrarian family or agrarian country. We derived identity from the place that we sat in, whether it was, the farm that was bringing in the corn, or maybe it was that we were serving that industry. We were the smith that took care of the shoes for the horses, or we ran the grain bin, but we drove identity around that concept of vision. So anyhow, that's what vision is. Mission is, it's the instruction around daily duty. What do we do every single day to accomplish the vision? So mission is usually much more practical and instructional. Usually it's, what did mom and dad always say? So maybe it's the idea of, the old hymn, trust and obey, was one of those concepts. So it's things like that that you try to drive out for families so they've got a path to follow.
I think that's so well said. And I think that oftentimes I forget that if I don't have a clear vision for myself, I will just end up somewhere. And that somewhere isn't necessarily where I want to be. It's just a place, right? And the unfortunate part is, for me, when I do that in my life, then I just end up in a place, and I go, well, how the heck did I get here? And truthfully, we didn't cast the vision in the first place to help us get to where we want to go, and put the guardrails on that. Of here's our vision, this is where we want to go, and then we've got our mission, our guardrails on, hey, this is going to keep us every single day. If we keep doing these things and keep following our values, then we can actually end up where we wanted to be in the first place.
I go back constantly to that moment. I talk about this, I think, on every podcast we record. It's that Cheshire Cat moment in Alice in Wonderland, where the Cheshire Cat says, hey, listen, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I do think it's indicative of our generation to be kind of wandering. We're wandering. Where are we going? We don't know. And so we're everywhere, we're nowhere. It's an abdication of our responsibility as leaders, whether that's leaders in our homes as fathers and mothers, or leaders in our businesses as executives, as owners, whatever role we may play. And so, Bill, one of the key takeaways I've taken from my 7th gen and legacy stone training with you has been really two key things if I want to uh, put a legacy in motion in my family. One is, these are the practical things. One is a weekly family meeting. Now, right now, that looks a certain way with, a 5, 2, and 1 month old, right? And for you, it looks very differently with adult children, and grandchildren. But that's one thing. But the second thing I think is very near and dear to your heart. It's an area of passion and an area of deep expertise for you, which is the place of generosity. And you've said to me before that if you want to set something in motion, you want to set a legacy in motion, you actually start with giving. So could you explain to us why that is the place to start as it relates to the practical implementation of all these principles?
Well, one, the research tells us that the families who are generous stay together. They're much more likely to last for generations. And one of the reasons why that's true is because generosity forces you to look outside of yourself. It's the antidote for greed. So, again, it moves you away from that hyper individualistic state to a place of saying, hey, we live and we belong in community, so we've got to help one another out. So it's more likely to retain the strength of the unit. But at a personal level, if you help your kids to be generous, man, they're just better. They're just more helpful. They are people who love one another, serve one another. They recognize that life is not just about them. And then additionally, I would say that generosity is one of the places where we come to the table as equals. You and I, Taylor here, we could sit and have a conversation and we could all bump up against areas of expertise, whether it's the coaching consulting world, any of that kind of stuff. We could probably try to give Taylor pointers on how to run a podcast. And he's like, hey, no, I know how to do this. But if we talked about giving as an experience, we could all come to the table and say, well, here's who I support and here's what I do. We come to the table clearly as equals, and that's a shared experience. So when you do that inside of a family, it's that same kind of idea without the imposition of position and power that a mom or dad might have or an older brother might have over a younger sister.
Giving and gratefulness equals a good family, right? Equals a family that's going to last. I really like that.
Let's land this plane, brother. I want to be sensitive to Bill's time and to the time of our listeners, but I know we've got a couple more questions that we love to put each listener through.
Yeah, we got all right, Bill. So this is going to be fun. Hopefully you think this is fun. Brad and I started off the podcast and kind of talked about this idea that so much in leadership and life really is about paradoxes and managing this tension, right? The different tensions that we go through on a daily basis. So we've got this session, this kind of game that we play. We call it slow burn. It's supposed to be rapid fire, fast ideas, but we're going to give you two ideas, right? And you got to choose one, and they're probably going to be really hard to choose. Brad's going to throw them out there and he's going to say, an easy one would be, that, hey, Red Sox or Yankees. That's easy, right? But these are going to be some more challenging ones. And basically the way this works is you'll get to choose one of them. So we'll say, hey, which one do you think? And then you get about 15 seconds to tell us why, and then we're moving on. So hopefully it's a good time. You ready? You ready, Brad? You gonna rapid fire here?
Let's go. Okay, so first one, a little bit esoteric, but hang with me here. What's more important in leadership? Is it being or doing?
It's clearly being. The being is that sense of self, sense of identity, sense of purpose. No question.
Love it. Clear.
People or tasks? What's more important in leadership?
People. You can fail at a strategic plan, but if you have motivated people, you know that they're loved and cared for, they're going to win.
Framed a little bit differently, relationships or results?
Relationships drive results.
It's well said. Well said. Love it. All right. Values or vision?
I don't know that you can do an or on that one. I think you got to have both, because if all you have is vision, you could end up being in a place where you have legalism. You have a place of hard places. But if you have values with no vision, as your colleague Brandon says, you might just have happy, comfortable people that aren't driving towards anything. You got to have both.
Yeah, that's good. All right, we'll take it. I like that. All right, culture or productivity?
Culture drives productivity. So culture.
That's good. And then the last one to wrap up here, recovery or like maintenance of oneself or performance.
So what are my options? Recovery or performance?
Yep.
Okay. I'm not sure how I answer that one because it seems to me that if you perform in what you are supposed to be doing, you're not going to need as much recovery.
Hmm. That's a that's a great take. I haven't actually heard that one before. We've asked this a lot of times. That's really good. So if I'm performing the way that I'm kind of designed and created to perform, then I don't need as much recovery.
Yeah, because in theory, if you're performing, part of that performance would be rest. And so, that'd be a natural part of your rhythm. So as a result, you don't have to recover.
I like it. Man, that's great. That's great. Well, this has been really fun.
Thank you so much for your insight, for your wisdom. Thank you so much for just giving us a teaching on what does it mean to have a strong family culture and why is it so important. And I can't wait for our listeners to be exposed to all of your insight. Where do they go if they want to find you? If they want to learn more about what you're up to?
Well, there's a few places. So I'm like a lot of entrepreneurs, I've got a personal website, billhigh.com. Our consulting website is Seventh Gen Consulting. They go there. And then our nonprofit website, legacystone.com. So all those places, they get a lot of different resources, but a lot of helpful teaching that, as we say, we can help families win today and win for generations.
Man, that's so good. And all of that will be in our show notes. So if you are interested in getting connected there, interested in any of those different avenues, please take a look at those show notes and go to those websites. So, man, Bill, absolute joy, like Brad was saying, to have you on. And if you are a Daily Leader fan, we do ask, please like, subscribe, tell your mother, your father, your sister, your brother to all do the same thing so we can keep putting out this content and getting to interview incredible people like Bill. So with that, we will see you again next time on the Daily Leader.